Good morning. I want to thank the organizers of the 2020 FAIR Medical Student Anesthesia Research Fellowship virtual program for inviting me to present at this panel on clinical and translational research in anesthesiology. I also want to thank all of you for attending this session. My talk is focused on how to pick a question for translational research. It's geared in particular towards medical students who are interested in exploring careers in biomedical research in the clinical practice of anesthesiology and the perioperative sciences. But I hope that parts of this talk will also be helpful to residents and fellows who are interested in doing research as part of their academic anesthesiology career. It is indeed a daunting task to choose a research question and to embark upon a research project. And I think there are several challenges that I hope that some of you will take on during your career. And those are to pick a research topic that excites you, to develop projects that are feasible and may have impact in the clinical arena, and to develop projects that lay the groundwork for you to develop a sustainable research program. As I was preparing this talk, I reflected on how the definition of translational research has evolved over the years since it was first developed in the late 1990s to describe research that took discoveries from the bench to the clinical arena. Over the intervening years, the definition of translational research has really broadened and now includes research that takes discoveries from the bench to the bedside and actually back to the bench again. And in 2008, this article in JAMA nicely described some broad categories of translational research, including research that harnesses knowledge from basic sciences to produce treatments in the form of drugs and devices for humans, and research to ensure that new treatments and research knowledge reach the intended patients and populations and are correctly implemented. A further sub-definition of translational research is described in this article in the Journal of Clinical Translational Sciences in 2017, in which they describe these 5 subcategories of translational research. T1, bringing research from basic through science through early testing in humans. T2, establishing the effectiveness in humans and clinical guidelines. T3 focuses on implementation and dissemination research. T4 on outcomes and effectiveness in populations. And then T0 is research that actually wraps back around to basic, to the bench. And that would include things like using genome-wide association studies to drive basic questions that can be answered in the laboratory. So I hope from this that you can see that translational research encompasses a very wide spectrum of topics, methods, and models, including even in vitro studies of cells. And I hope you can appreciate that there's lots of opportunity for translational research in anesthesiology and the perioperative sciences. And just to hone in a little bit more on that, I provide this slide just listing a bunch of different topics and areas and diseases that fall within the scope of anesthesia research, and really a very, very wide spectrum of processes falls in the purview of anesthesia research. And that's one thing that's very exciting about doing anesthesiology as a discipline, is that you get exposed to so many different clinical arenas as an anesthesiologist. And this can really lead to the generation of some very interesting research ideas and directions. I found the following framework sort of helpful in defining my own research program and research directions. And I sort of think of research as being in different levels or different tiers. There's a broad research area that is, say, critical care medicine or anesthesia safety or neurosciences. And then these actually can give rise to these, within broad research areas, there are research topics. And these are a little bit more narrow, for instance, the immunology of sepsis, or the neuroscience of anesthetics. And under given research topics come specific research questions and projects. And one can actually enter this process or this framework at different stages, and it's really individualized how you actually get into research, how one gets into research. In some cases, people may have clinical experiences or other life experiences that have led them to actually hone in on specific questions right away, or to think about top research topics that have then led to their interest in broad research areas. So broad research area is a long-term focus. It gives rise to specific research topics. And some examples of broad research areas: pain, sepsis, neurosciences, etc. Research topics are less broad than the broad research areas, but they're not highly specific like a question. And I tend to think of overarching goals as being the research topic. So under, for instance, if I'm writing a grant application, there's an overarching goal that I have. And under that, there's a bunch of questions and sort of sub-projects that will help to answer that overarching goal. So the research topic gives rise to specific questions. And then finally, the topic at hand are specific research questions and projects. And these are answered with experiments, data collection, and analysis. They're hypothesis driven, and they lead to manuscripts and funding. So they lead to sort of concrete evidence of research. And some examples include the role and potential therapeutic value of microglial TNF signaling in the development of post-injury chronic pain, the effects of intraoperative transfusion on perioperative outcomes, etc. And so using this paradigm, you can envision a situation where you have a broad research area under which you develop a research topic that you're focused on. And within that research topic, there may be a series of research questions and projects that arise. And this can happen with multiple research topics. So ideally, over the course of your career, you develop multiple research topics under a broad area. And from each of these topics comes a variety of questions that you can answer through your career and that you can assign to answer in conjunction with research trainees and mentees along the way. So choosing a research direction is really a very individual thing and a very personal thing. And there are numerous factors that influence and drive the choice of research topics. But again, in the end, it's a very individual decision. Some of the factors that can influence these decisions include your intrinsic fascination with a subject or concept, your drive to improve the human condition, your own individual abilities, your personality. You may be a collaborative person and very into having multidisciplinary collaborations, or you may be a more solitary personality type that is perhaps more oriented towards bioinformatics or computational biology research. Life's experiences certainly influence and drive the choices of topics, your clinical interests. A sort of practical factor is how you want to split your time between clinical work and research. Other practical factors include what the research climate is, what's hot, what's being funded, and what's going on in your institution and within your department. What are your mentors and collaborators doing? So I'm going to just go on to some recommendations and comments that I have about picking a translational or picking a question for translational research. And I encourage you to also sound out other people that are well along in their fields to find out their thoughts on how to pick translational research questions. So number one, pick an area and topic that excites you. You are much more likely to zealously pursue your research project and to succeed if you're working on a project that fascinates you. Also, your excitement is going to help sustain you through the inevitable bumps that arise during a research career, such as difficulties with grant funding or problems with papers getting published. Secondly, capitalize on your abilities. Know what you're good at. Take a look at what you're good at. Are you mathematically and quantitatively oriented? Are you visually oriented? Are you reductionistic and like thinking about things in terms of pathways and molecules, or are you expansive? Are you technically oriented, or are you more cerebrally inclined? Are you extroverted or introverted? Do you like working with patients, or do you like working with data? And there's so many other things, abilities that you have that come into play in making your individual decision about your research question. Number three, pick a project that's doable and is clinically relevant. Okay, one thing I want to say here is that mechanistic in vitro studies may be clinically relevant. So contrary to what you might think, that mechanistic studies are really basic science, they may fall within translational research. So the feasibility of your project is hugely important. You need to ensure that you have the tools available to answer your questions and that you have all the other resources, personnel, advisors, mentors, to help you with answering your question. Carefully choose your mentor or your mentors. The importance of the research mentor cannot be overestimated. It's hugely important. So some things to consider in choosing your primary research mentor. What's their history of mentoring? Have they mentored people successfully before? Do you find their work interesting and relevant? Do you feel like they can be a role model for you? Are you comfortable interacting with them and with their team? I suggest that you meet with several potential mentors, particularly if you have any uncertainty. I also recommend that you attend lab meeting or the research groups meeting. This may be difficult if you're not in the same location, but with all the virtual capability that we have these days, I think that this is a possibility and something to consider. Number five, try to align your research and clinical focuses if possible. I found that very helpful, that I very frequently use my experiences in the intensive care unit to guide and inform the topics that I choose to study, the specific questions that I choose to answer in sepsis and critical care. Also, there's some efficiency here. Number one, national meetings often have research and clinical components, so you can get both in one shot. And also, you may be more efficient in moving research findings into the clinical arena, into clinical trials, for instance. Number six, explore various research options before you commit. Explore different research projects, meet with multiple potential mentors, even consider doing short-term research rotations in a couple of different research settings so that you can figure out if you're interested in the research that's going on there and in working with that mentor and their group. Take time. Don't lock yourself into an area, topic, or long-term mentor too early. Spend time looking and thinking. Think about how you want to balance your clinical and research work eventually. The viability and success of different research pathways really depend on the amount of research time you have, and there are a lot of different possibilities for how you do split your research time. You can do mostly clinical with a little bit of research, an equal balance between the two, mostly research with a little bit of clinical work, or only research. Which of these you do will influence how you choose your research question. Be tenacious and be flexible. Be willing to adapt and adjust. Tenacity and patience is really important because things often don't work right away and you really need to persevere. You should be open to adapting your research plan to take into account your preliminary findings, unforeseen problems and issues, and comments of people who are learning about your work, your reviewers on manuscripts and grants, and your mentors. You should also be open to abandoning a line of inquiry if the project isn't working, the mentoring situation isn't satisfactory, or you find that the topic simply doesn't excite you. Finally, get lots of advice. Get lots of advice from supervisors and advisors and potential mentors, former mentors, faculty in the fields of interest, and peers. Spend time talking to people, thinking about what works best for your individual personality, your clinical interests, and what really inspires you. Thank you.